right, last week, the House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan announced that documents that were subpoenaed by his committee prove that Facebook and Instagram censored posts and changed their content moderation policies following an unconstitutional pressure campaign that was applied by the Biden White House. You'll recall probably also that it was the White House strong-arm tactics such as this that led a federal judge to limit the Biden administration's communication with social media companies following lawsuits from attorney generals in Louisiana and Missouri. And catch this, their filings describe the actions of the Biden administration as, quote, the most egregious violations of the First Amendment in the history of the United States, end quote. That is enormously profound. Of course. Well, joining me now to discuss this and more is one of those very individuals behind all of this, Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey. Attorney General Bailey, welcome back to Washington Watch. Always great to have you.
Thank you for having me on. Great to be here.
Well, listen, I'm sure that what Congressman Jordan released was no surprise to you, but nonetheless, just tell us your reaction to receiving really what amounts to further proof for everything that you've been saying about the censorship enterprise that's been taking place at the Biden White House.
Well, this clearly demonstrates a relationship of coercion and collusion from the White House across a spectrum of federal bureaucratic agencies with woke big tech social media corporations to silence American voices in violation of the First Amendment. And we're going to keep fighting to protect our First Amendment right to free speech. I mean, look, nobody thinks it's a good idea to live in a world where the federal government and Joe Biden get to decide what we should and shouldn't be talking about. They don't get to decide what is and isn't true. We as people, we as citizens get to decide that through free, fair, and open debate unimpeded by federal censorship. The remedy for false speech in this nation has always been counter speech, not government censorship. And yet what these documents further corroborate is there's absolutely government censorship going on. I think what's most frightening is that the White House clearly pushed Facebook and other big tech social media corporations beyond their own censorship policies. It's bad enough when big tech social media is silencing American voices, but what this demonstrates is the White House was most concerned about silencing conservative voices, truthful speech, core political speech, and push these corporations well beyond the bounds of their own internal policies. So we got to keep fighting back. We've got to build a wall of separation between tech and state. The first brick of that wall was laid on July 4th, and we're going to keep fighting to build that wall in preparation for this next election cycle next year to prevent the federal government from stifling and silencing free, fair, and open debate about the election.
Well, thank you so much for pushing that fight forward. And listen, you're exactly right. What is taking place in this White House. I played this a little bit earlier. But I want to play it for you and get your reaction based on what you just said. Clip number 7. This is who was then House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. Listen to this comment she made.
In terms of actions, Alex, that we have taken, or we're working to take, I should say, from the federal government, we've increased disinformation research and tracking within the Surgeon General's office. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation.
She admits what you were just talking about, but the issue was not disinformation. They were going after much more than disinformation. And by the way, disinformation is not illegal anyway. I mean, people say things that are not right all the time, but that was not the issue for the administration. I mean, they were going after censoring what you said, the voices of Americans. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I mean, look, the White House and these federal officials are operating with brazen impunity to violate our First Amendment rights. These are the worst First Amendment violations in this nation's history. And the court, the district court that laid that first brick in the wall of separation between tech and state on July 4th, all the court said in that court order, all that injunction says is you can't censor core political speech. You can't coerce and collude with big tech social media to censor political speech in violation of the First Amendment. Well, why is the Department of Justice appealing that? Why are they saying we'll be irreparably harmed if we don't get a chance to coerce and collude with big tech social media? why does anyone think it would be a good idea for Jen Psaki and other federal officials to decide what is and isn't disinformation? To your point, this is scary stuff. The court has described it as a dystopian scenario, as downright Orwellian. And what we know is that COVID was really the Trojan horse that got the enemy behind the wall. The federal government and the White House justified the censorship enterprise because they wanted to decrease vaccine hesitancy or decrease hesitancy about wearing masks. They silenced political speech. They silence truthful speech, but they also silence almost exclusively conservative speech. And what we know is that they've now outsourced and expanded that vast censorship enterprise to new federal agencies and to quasi-governmental agencies to try to do indirectly what they're going to be prohibited from doing directly. And it's gone beyond just COVID. Now, anything that they don't like that we're saying on big tech social media, they think they have the right to censor. It's clearly that runs afoul of the founders' understanding and the intent of the First Amendment right to free speech.
Absolutely. Exclamation point. Well said. And listen, speaking of disinformation, at that same time that Jen Psaki gave her quote, the president himself ramped up all this pressure on Facebook when he was asked about some of these messages in the pandemic. And he said, look, the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated, and they're killing people. I mean, you talk about disinformation. But, that's why I say this whole thing is not about disinformation. It's about control and censoring, specifically, as you say, conservative speech.
Yeah, this has never been about truth. It's always been about power for the Biden administration, those federal officials. This started with the deep state and the Hunter Biden laptop story back in 2020. And then as soon as President Biden hit the stump, he was threatening big tech social media to revoke or amend Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is clearly their cash cow, their economic boon, and has allowed this monopoly to grow and become unwieldy. When he took office, he then took to the White House podium and said that Facebook was killing people because they weren't doing enough censorship. And then he stuck his army of federal bureaucrats on him and said, hey, we want more censorship. Here's what it should look like. We had uncovered more than 20,000 documents as part of the discovery in our lawsuit that had demonstrated that. But what Representative Jordan has done is uncover from a flip side of that same coin from the big tech social media side, corroborating everything we learned. It's like a ripple in the pond. The White House threw the stone in the pond, and you can see the ripples in these emails. And what we know is that big tech social media was pushed beyond their censorship policies, and Americans suffered for it. And we're not going to let Joe Biden destroy free speech in America.
Well, I tell you, I wish we had more time. I'd love to talk to you for much more. This thing's got to go further, and it will, because people like you are pushing this. Attorney General from Missouri, Andrew Bailey, thank you so much for your hard work. Thank you for joining us on Washington Watch this evening.
Thank you for having me on.